Lieutenant Robert Johnson saw the flash of sunlight on metal above him and immediately knew what it meant. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s were diving out of the sun at noon, and his P-47 Thunderbolt was positioned at the back of the formation, the most vulnerable spot. The first burst of cannon fire hit him before he could react. 20mm shells tore through half-Pepin's fuselage, and the cockpit exploded in a shower of glass and metal. Oil splattered across Johnson's goggles, blinding him as his canopy shattered into pieces. He tried to eject the canopy and bail out, but the hydraulic system was already destroyed. The manual release wouldn't budge. The frame had warped from the impacts, and he was trapped in a burning aircraft at 24,000 feet over occupied France. Then the fire started. Flames erupted from behind the instrument panel, licking at his legs and hands. The smell of burning aviation fuel filled the air, and Johnson realized he had only about 30 seconds before the aircraft either exploded or he was burned alive. This was June 26, 1943, and Robert Johnson was about to learn just how much punishment a P-47 Thunderbolt could withstand before it stopped flying. What followed in the next 17 minutes would become one of the most remarkable survival stories of World War II, ending with a moment of respect between enemies that defied everything both sides believed about aerial combat. To understand how Johnson survived what happened next, you need to know who he was and what he was flying. Robert Johnson had dreamed of flying since he was 11 years old. Growing up in Elton, Oklahoma, during the Great Depression, he paid for his first flying lessons with money earned from odd jobs at a woodworking shop. Starting at age 12, he took flying lessons, eventually accumulating 35 hours of flight time over 4 years and earning his private pilot's license at 16. It was an extraordinary achievement for a boy who could barely see over the cockpit. When the war broke out in 1941, Johnson enlisted immediately. He first trained as a bomber pilot but switched to fighters, a decision that would define his legacy. By early 1943, he was a lieutenant in the 56th Fighter Group stationed in England, flying escort missions for heavy bombers deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. His aircraft was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. At 7 tons fully loaded, the P-47 was much larger than its contemporaries. Pilots called it the Jug because of its massive radial engine cowling. Some joked that it wasn't so much climbed into as put on like a suit. But the Thunderbolt's size came with advantages. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, and the aircraft could endure tremendous punishment and still keep flying. The air-cooled radial engine, with its 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, could lose several cylinders and still produce power. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. Johnson had named his P-47 Half-P Pint, a sardonic reference to the fighter's massive size. On June 26, 1943, he was flying his 16th combat mission, escorting B-17 flying fortresses returning from a raid near Paris. His squadron of 48 Thunderbolts had rendezvoused with the bombers over the French coast and was providing top cover as the formation headed back across the English Channel. Johnson was positioned at the rear of the formation, weaving back and forth to watch for enemy fighters. It was the most dangerous position, exposed and isolated, but someone had to do it. Johnson had seen the Focke-Wulf 190s climbing from below, but he assumed they were targeting the bombers. Then they continued climbing directly toward his vulnerable position, and he realized with chilling certainty that he was their target. The 16 Focke-Wulf 190s attacked Johnson's Thunderbolt in coordinated waves. The German pilots were experienced and knew exactly how to attack the massive American fighter. The first burst shattered Johnson's canopy and destroyed his hydraulic system. The second wave tore through the fuselage from tail to nose, severing control cables and puncturing fuel lines. Oil from the engine sprayed across the windscreen, covering Johnson's goggles and face. The 20mm cannon shells and 7.92mm machine gun bullets ripped through half-pint's aluminum skin. The sound was deafening, a continuous hammering interrupted only by the deeper booms of cannon impacts. Each hit sent shrapnel flying through the cockpit. Johnson felt sharp pains in his hands and legs as metal fragments tore into his flesh. The instrument panel disintegrated. Glass from shattered gauges mixed with the oil covering his face. The throttle quadrant took multiple hits, jamming it at full power. Johnson's radio went dead. His compass spun uselessly. Then came the fire. Flames erupted from behind the instrument panel where hydraulic fluid and fuel lines had been severed. The fire spread quickly in the 100-mph wind stream, blasting through the shattered canopy. Johnson could feel his gloves beginning to smolder. The skin on his face felt as though it was cooking. He grabbed the manual canopy release and pulled with all his strength. Nothing. The canopy frame had warped from the impacts and refused to budge. He tried. Panic rose within Johnson, but he couldn't give up. The escape hatch was jammed shut by the damage to the aircraft's structure. Trapped inside a burning fighter with the flames creeping toward the fuel tanks, he had only seconds to act. His options were stark: stay in the cockpit and burn to death, or take a desperate risk. He pushed the stick forward into a steep dive, using the increased airspeed to extinguish the flames with raw airflow. The Thunderbolt plunged toward the French countryside, accelerating past 400 mm. The maneuver worked. The fire went out. But now, Johnson was diving vertically at full throttle with a jammed throttle, no hydraulics, limited control, and German fighters still attacking him. Johnson managed to pull out of the dive at 8,000 feet, the G-forces pinning him to his seat. The Thunderbolt shuddered violently as it leveled off, pieces of the aircraft tearing away in the slipstream. He could see daylight through holes in both wings. The right aileron was nearly gone. Control surfaces were shredded, but somehow the engine was still running. The massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine had taken multiple hits, but kept producing power. Black smoke poured from the cowling, and oil continued to coat everything. But the propeller was still turning. Johnson wiped oil from his goggles and tried to assess his situation. He was deep in enemy territory, flying a crippled fighter that should already be in pieces. His squadron was gone, lost in the dive. Alone, wounded, and hunted by the Luftwaffe's most skilled pilots, Johnson turned toward the English Channel, hoping to get home. Each control input produced unexpected results. The stick felt loose, disconnected. Several control cables had been severed, and Johnson was now flying the Thunderbolt with trim tabs and sheer willpower. The aircraft constantly wanted to roll left, and he had to hold full right stick just to maintain level flight. Then he saw it. One Focke-Wulf 190 had followed him down and was now on his tail, just out of firing range. The German pilot was waiting for the Thunderbolt to slow down or lose control. Johnson pushed the throttle forward, but it was already jammed at full power. There was nothing more he could do to go faster. The WWII closed the distance. Johnson saw the muzzle flashes as the German pilot opened fire again. More impacts, more holes appeared in the wings. A chunk of his right elevator tore away. The Thunderbolt bucked and shook but kept flying. Johnson tried evasive maneuvers, but with damaged controls, his options were limited. Every turn drained energy he couldn't afford to lose. The German stayed on him, firing burst after burst. Johnson counted the hits out loud to stay conscious, each burst sending more shrapnel through the cockpit. 50 hits, 75, 100. The French coast was still minutes away. Johnson didn't know if half-pint could make it another mile, let alone across the English Channel. His hands were burned. Blood dripped from shrapnel wounds. Oil and hydraulic fluid coated every surface. And the German was still firing. The German pilot was methodical, moving in close to within 200 yards, firing a burst, then pulling up slightly to assess the damage before attacking again. Johnson could see him clearly through the oil-smeared remains of his canopy. The WWII pristine and undamaged, was painted in sharp gray and green camouflage against the blue sky. 120 hits. 150. Johnson kept counting. His left hand bled freely now, as a cannon shell had punched through the cockpit floor near his feet, and he could see the ground below through the hole. The engine coughed, missed a beat, then caught again. Johnson's heart skipped. If the engine quit now, he was done. No power meant no control, and the Thunderbolt would spin uncontrollably. But the Pratt and Whitney kept running, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed any inline engine. Johnson crossed the French coast at 2,000 feet, the English Channel stretching ahead. 18 miles of open water stood between him and England. The German followed him over the water, still firing. Johnson couldn't understand why the Thunderbolt was still flying. The damage was catastrophic. The engine should have seized, the controls should have failed, but the aircraft was still going. 175 hits. 180. The German pilot grew increasingly frustrated, continuing his attacks on this lone American fighter that refused to go down. Johnson saw the white cliffs of Dover ahead. England. Safety, maybe, if the engine held, if the controls didn't fail, if the German ran out of ammunition. The FW-190 moved in even closer. But then, something changed. The Germans stopped firing. The Focke-Wulf slid forward, pulling alongside Johnson's battered Thunderbolt. For a moment, the two fighters flew in formation, separated by only 30 feet of air. Johnson could see the German pilot clearly through the Focke-Wulf's canopy. The German pilot was staring at Huffy-Pint, assessing the damage, his head moving as he observed the battered aircraft. The plane was riddled with holes, the tail resembling something that had been attacked with a chainsaw. Hydraulic fluid and oil poured out of several punctures. It was impossible for this aircraft to still be flying, and yet somehow it was maintaining altitude and heading. The German pilot looked across at Johnson. Their eyes met briefly across the 30 feet of sky separating them. Then the German did something that Johnson would never forget. He raised his gloved hand to his forehead in a precise military salute, held it for a long second, and then banked away, heading back toward France, his ammunition and fuel running low. Johnson was now alone over the English Channel, flying a wreck of a plane that had survived over 200 hits and 21 cannon shells, all because an enemy pilot had run out of ways to kill him. That German pilot's salute to Robert Johnson marked more than just a pilot's survival. It represented a shift in how both sides saw the air war over Europe. The German pilot's identity remains debated. Many historians believe it was Egon Meyer, the Luftwaffe ace known for his head-on attack technique that was devastating to American bomber formations. Meyer was flying in that sector that day, and his attack style matched his known tactics. Others believe it could have been any experienced JG-2 pilot who realized that continuing to fire at an aircraft that refused to die was pointless. Regardless of who he was, the incident marked a turning point in how German pilots viewed American fighters. For the Luftwaffe, it became a nightmare scenario. If an American fighter could withstand 200 machine gun rounds and 21 cannon shells and still make it home, what did that say about their armament? The standard 20mm MG-151 cannon was supposed to be decisive. A few hits should have destroyed any fighter. Yet, this Thunderbolt had taken dozens of cannon hits and still kept flying. German pilots began reporting the P-47's incredible durability to their squadrons. The psychological effect spread quickly. When you shot at a Spitfire or a P-51, you could see the damage. Control surfaces tore away. Coolant streamed from punctured radiators, and engines seized. But the P-47 just kept coming. What Johnson didn't know, as he nursed Huffy-Pint across the English Channel, was that his survival was proving something that Republic aviation engineers had been claiming for months. The P-47 wasn't just big and heavy. It was the most survivable fighter in the European theater, and the word was spreading fast. The salute itself was significant beyond the moment. In an era of total war, Where mercy was rare and survival was everything, that German pilot made a choice. He had exhausted his ammunition trying to kill Johnson. He could have rammed the crippled Thunderbolt, a tactic that some desperate Luftwaffe pilots were beginning to use. Instead, he acknowledged the impossible, saluted an enemy who had somehow defied death, and withdrew. It was a moment that reminded both sides that, beneath the propaganda and hatred, they were all pilots, men who understood what it took to strap into a machine and fight at 400 mph, where mistakes meant instant death. The salute was one professional acknowledging another's skill and luck in equal measure. But there was more to it. The German pilot was out of ammunition and probably low on fuel, and he knew it. The salute wasn't just respect. It was resignation. He had tried everything to kill Johnson, used all his bullets and shells, and the American was still flying. What else could he do but acknowledge the impossible and go home? For American pilots hearing the story later, Johnson's survival became instant legend. It validated everything they had been told about the P-47's toughness. If Johnson could take 200 hits and still make it home, maybe they could too. The psychological boost was immeasurable. Confidence in your aircraft makes you a better pilot, more willing to press attacks, and less likely to break off prematurely. The Germans, meanwhile, faced the opposite problem. If standard ammunition loads couldn't reliably kill P-47s, what would? Some pilots started advocating for heavier 30mm cannons, but those had slower rates of fire and limited ammunition capacity. The problem had no easy solution, and every engagement with Thunderbolts carried increased risk. Johnson crossed the English coast at 1,500 feet, barely maintaining altitude. Half-P Pint was slowly dying. The engine was rough. Multiple cylinders were damaged or destroyed, oil pressure was dropping, and the airframe shook continuously. Structural integrity was compromised by hundreds of holes and severed components. He had been flying for 17 minutes since the initial attack. Every second, he expected catastrophic failure. A wing could fold, the engine could seize, or a control cable could snap. But somehow, the Thunderbolt held together, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed a lesser aircraft. Johnson's group had been operating from RAF Manston as a forward base that day on the Kent coast. He headed there directly, unable to maneuver if any problems arose. His landing gear was hydraulically operated, and the hydraulic system had been destroyed. He would have to belly land, sliding the 7-ton fighter onto the grass. Other pilots from his squadron had made it back and were circling the field, low on fuel, but waiting to see if Johnson would appear. They had seen him go down during the initial attack. Johnson's squadron had assumed he was dead or captured. But when they spotted Half Pint approaching the field, trailing smoke and oil, barely maintaining altitude, radio chatter erupted in disbelief. Johnson set up for his approach. Without hydraulics, he couldn't lower his flaps, so he was coming in too fast. The damaged control surfaces made precise flying impossible. He had one chance to land. He lined up with the grass runway, the Thunderbolt struggling through the air like a wounded whale. The engine coughed again, and Johnson tightened his grip on the stick, urging the plane for just a few more seconds. At 140 mph, too fast for a safe landing, Johnson cut the mixture to shut down the engine, and the fighter settled toward the grass. The impact when it hit was brutal. Half-P Pint slid across the field on its belly, metal screeching, dirt and grass flying in all directions. It veered slightly left, then right, before finally grinding to a stop in a cloud of dust. Johnson sat motionless in the cockpit for a long moment, unable to move. He was alive. Against all odds, he had survived. Emergency crews rushed to the aircraft, fire extinguishers in hand and medics ready for the worst. When they finally opened the jammed canopy and pulled Johnson out, they were shocked that he was conscious, let alone able to walk. His hands and face were burned, and his flight suit was soaked with blood from multiple shrapnel wounds. Oil and hydraulic fluid covered every inch of him. But he was alive. The ground crew then began examining Half-P-Pint, and the true extent of the damage became clear. The maintenance teams and engineering officers at RAF Manston couldn't believe what they were seeing. The damage was beyond anything they'd ever encountered on an aircraft that had somehow made it home. After 2 hours of meticulous documentation, they stopped counting at 200 bullet holes and 21 cannon shell impacts. The actual number was likely higher, but some damage overlapped, where multiple hits struck the same area, making an accurate count impossible. Both wings looked like Swiss cheese, the fabric on the control surfaces hanging in tatters. Several ribs were completely severed. Hydraulic lines, electrical wiring, and fuel lines had been cut in multiple spots. The wings had somehow not folded under the stress of flight. The fuselage damage was even worse. Cannon shells had punched completely through the aircraft from side to side. The radio compartment was destroyed, and the armor plate behind Johnson's seat had stopped at least 3 rounds that would have killed him. The tail section had absorbed dozens of hits, and the rudder was barely attached. The engine told its own story. 7 of the 18 cylinders were damaged, and 2 were completely destroyed. Oil lines had been severed in several places, and the accessory section had taken direct hits. Cooling baffles were shredded, but the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine kept running, providing enough power to keep the aircraft in the air for 17 minutes and almost 60 miles. Republic Aviation had designed the P-47 with redundancy and survivability as core principles. But even the engineers who built it were amazed. Their worst-case scenario testing hadn't anticipated this level of damage. Half-P-Pint had absorbed punishment that exceeded every design parameter and still kept flying. The aircraft was officially declared beyond economical repair. The structural damage was too severe, and wartime production priorities meant that it was more practical to build a new plane than restore this one. Half-P-Pint was photographed extensively for training and publicity purposes before being scrapped for parts. But those photographs would travel across every American airbase in Europe. Pilots studied them, tracing their fingers over the documented holes, and they realized with absolute certainty that the P-47 Thunderbolt could get them home when nothing else would. Johnson was treated for burns and shrapnel wounds at the base infirmary. Doctors recommended 2 weeks of recovery, but he was back in the cockpit just 5 days later, flying a replacement Thunderbolt on another bomber escort mission. The word around the squadron was simple. If Johnson could survive 200 hits, none of them had any excuse for not pressing their attacks. Robert Johnson's survival on June 26th was remarkable, but what came next proved that it wasn't luck. Over the next 11 months, he validated everything the P-47 Thunderbolt represented. He flew mission after mission, engaging German fighters with an aggression born from knowing exactly what his aircraft could endure. His kill count steadily climbed. By May 1944, Johnson had 27 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top American aces in the European theater. More significantly, he surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills, a record that had stood for 25 years. Johnson became the first USAF pilot in World War II to exceed Rickenbacker's mark, an achievement that made headlines back home and boosted morale across American air forces. His tactical approach evolved from his June 26th experience. He understood exactly what the P-47 could survive, and he used that knowledge to press attacks that other pilots might have backed away from. When engaging Focke-Wulf 190s, he didn't flinch when taking hits. He knew that unlike German fighters with their vulnerable liquid-cooled engines, his radial engine could lose cylinders and keep running. Johnson specialized in head-on attacks, a tactic requiring nerves of steel. 2 fighters charging at each other head-on at a closing speed of over 600 mph, Johnson didn't hesitate. At just 2 seconds to line up, fire, and break away, Johnson knew the pressure of a head-on attack. Most pilots couldn't handle the psychological stress, but Johnson thrived on it. His June 26th experience had erased any fear of taking damage. His unit, the 56th Fighter Group, became the highest-scoring P-47 group in the European theater by the war's end, with 674 confirmed kills. Johnson's aggressive tactics and faith in the Thunderbolt's durability spread throughout the group. Pilots knew that if they took hits, the P-47 would likely get them home. By May 1944, Johnson had flown 91 combat missions. He had been recommended for rotation back to the United States multiple times, but kept volunteering for more missions. Finally, the Army Air Forces made it an order. Johnson was needed for training new pilots, and they couldn't risk losing him after he had become such a valuable asset. Johnson returned to the United States in May 1944 and spent the remainder of the war touring Republic Aviation factories, speaking to workers about how their craftsmanship had saved his life. His message was simple and powerful. Every rivet, every panel, every system they installed could be the difference between a pilot living or dying. The workers heard him. The man standing before them was living proof that their work mattered. After the war, Johnson became a test pilot for Republic Aviation, using his extensive knowledge of the P-47 to evaluate new variants and improvements. He helped develop training procedures that emphasized the Thunderbolt's survivability. His insights influenced the design of post-war fighters, particularly with regard to pilot protection and structural redundancy. The story of Robert Johnson and Half-P Pint became one of the defining narratives of American air power in World War II. It proved something beyond statistics and specifications. When pilots trust their aircraft completely, they fight more effectively. The P-47. Thunderbolt's reputation for toughness had already been established before June 26, 1943, but Johnson's survival turned it into legend. Throughout the European theater, pilots knew the Jug would bring them home. This confidence translated into more aggressive tactics that German pilots couldn't match. Luftwaffe veterans interviewed after the war consistently mentioned the P-47's durability as a psychological factor. When you hit a Thunderbolt, you expected to see results, but instead, it kept coming. That created hesitation and split-second doubts that could be fatal in air combat. Some German pilots admitted to breaking off attacks on damaged P-47s, assuming other fighters had delivered the killing blow, only to learn later that the Thunderbolt had made it home. The German pilot who saluted Johnson was never conclusively identified, although the theory that it was Egon Meyer remains the most widely accepted. Meyer, one of Germany's top aces, was killed in action on March 2, 1944. He died with 102 confirmed victories, but his final months in combat were marked by growing frustration with the durability of American fighters. Republic Aviation used Johnson's story extensively in their marketing. Photographs of Half-P Pint's damage appeared in training manuals, promotional materials for war bonds, and post-war histories. The aircraft became the symbol of everything Republic had hoped to achieve. A fighter that could absorb catastrophic damage and still complete its mission. Johnson lived until December 27, 1998, passing away at 78. He spent decades after the war speaking about his experiences, always emphasizing the quality of American engineering and the bravery of his fellow pilots. His 1958 memoir, Thunderbolt, co-authored with Martin Caidin, became a classic of aviation literature, introducing new generations to the reality of air combat over Europe. At his funeral, 3 F-16 Fighting Falcons from the Air National Guard performed a missing man formation, a fitting tribute to a pilot who had defined what it meant to be a fighter ace. He was buried with full military honors, his grave marker. Noting his 27 aerial victories and his status as one of America's top aces, the P-47 Thunderbolt flew 546,000 combat sorties during World War II, more than any other American fighter. It destroyed 11,174 enemy aircraft, 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, and 68,000 trucks. But its greatest achievement might have been the 3,499 pilots who survived being shot down in P-47s, a survival rate unparalleled in aviation warfare. Robert Johnson's survival on June 26, 1943, wasn't just one man's extraordinary luck. It was a validation of every engineering decision made by Republic Aviation. Every extra pound of armor, every redundant system, every design choice that prioritized pilot survival over marginal performance gains. It proved that sometimes in war, the greatest victories aren't measured by enemies killed, but by friends brought home alive. Today, several P-47 Thunderbolts remain airworthy, flying at air shows where they demonstrate the massive radial engine Z, distinctive sound, and the aircraft's impressive performance. When aviation enthusiasts see these aircraft, they're seeing the fighter that absorbed 200 hits and still flew home. The fighter that earned a salute from an enemy who had tried everything to bring it down and failed. That's the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. That's the story of Robert Johnson. And that's why a German ace's salute over the English Channel in 1943 became one of the most powerful moments in aviation history.